For most of human history, debt was something people feared, avoided, and treated as a temporary emergency. But today, the global economy is built on a number so large that it barely fits on a screen. A number so abstract that it no longer feels real, even though it quietly shapes every job, every government promise, and every financial crisis. And the uncomfortable truth is that global debt did not explode because of one mistake, one greedy generation, or one reckless policy, but because over time, debt stopped being seen as a burden and slowly became the solution to every problem we did not want to solve directly. And once that psychological shift occurred, once borrowing replaced restraint as the default response to stress, the system began moving in a direction that is very difficult to reverse. And to understand how we reached a point where global debt exceeds global economic output by a staggering margin, we have to start not with numbers, but with incentives. Because debt is never just about money. It is about who benefits now, who pays later, and why humans consistently choose short-term relief over long-term stability, especially when the costs are delayed and distributed across millions of people who may not even realize they are carrying them. And the story begins long before modern finance, back when debt was personal, visible, and socially enforced, when borrowing meant owing a specific person, often within a small community, where reputation mattered and default carried immediate consequences. And in those societies, debt naturally limited itself, because lenders were cautious, borrowers were constrained, and failure was costly in very human terms. But as economies grew larger and more complex, something subtle changed. Debt became institutional, anonymous, and abstract, moving from personal obligation to systemic mechanism. And that transformation accelerated dramatically with the rise of modern states, because governments discovered something individuals could never do. They could borrow without dying, without disappearing, without ever fully paying back. Because unlike a person, a state could roll its debts forward indefinitely, tax future citizens, and redefine repayment as stability rather than closure. And this was not initially reckless. In fact, it was often rational. Wars, infrastructure, and crises required resources that exceeded current revenues, and borrowing allowed societies to smooth costs across time, which worked reasonably well as long as growth outpaced debt and trust remained intact. But here is where the psychology began to change, because once leaders realized that borrowing postponed pain and delivered immediate results, political incentives shifted. Spending brought visibility, restraint brought criticism, and debt became the invisible bridge between promises and reality. And as long as economies grew and populations expanded, the bridge held, reinforcing the belief that debt was not dangerous but productive, a tool of progress rather than a claim on the future. And this belief hardened during the 20th century, especially after the trauma of the Great Depression, when governments learned a powerful lesson, that insufficient spending could collapse economies, while aggressive borrowing could revive them. And from that moment onward, debt was no longer just tolerated. It was actively encouraged during downturns, institutionalized through fiscal policy, normalized through central banking, and eventually embedded into the architecture of the global financial system. And the creation of fiat money severed the final psychological anchor to restraint, because once money was no longer tied to a physical commodity, borrowing became a matter of confidence rather than constraint. Governments could issue debt in their own currencies, central banks could stabilize markets, and crises could be delayed, softened, or deferred. And each successful intervention reinforced the idea that debt problems could always be managed later, that growth would eventually catch up, and that the system was fundamentally self-correcting. But systems do not drift into danger overnight. They drift gradually, through feedback loops that reward risk and punish caution. And one of the most powerful feedback loops was financialization, the process by which debt itself became a product, something to be packaged, traded, leveraged, and optimized, transforming borrowing from a means to an end into an end in itself. Because once lenders could sell risk, they no longer needed to hold it. And once borrowers could refinance indefinitely, repayment lost urgency. And this dynamic spread across households, corporations, and governments alike. Households learned that debt could bring forward future consumption. Corporations learned that leverage could boost returns and stock prices. And governments learned that deficits could be politically painless as long as markets remained calm. And at each level, the same logic applied. The benefits were immediate and concentrated, while the risks were delayed and diffused. And this asymmetry is crucial because human beings are exceptionally bad at managing slow-moving threats, especially when short-term rewards are tangible and visible. And nowhere was this more evident than in the decades following World War II, when rapid growth, technological progress, and expanding populations made debt appear harmless, even virtuous, because growth absorbed it, inflation eroded it, and productivity justified it. And by the time warning signs appeared, they were easy to dismiss as temporary anomalies. But the real shift occurred when growth began to slow, while borrowing continued to accelerate, a divergence that was initially subtle but eventually profound, because debt relies not just on growth but on expectations of future growth. And when those expectations are repeatedly disappointed, debt does not disappear, it accumulates. And this accumulation changes behavior, because heavily indebted systems become fragile, sensitive to shocks, and dependent on continued intervention, which in turn encourages even more borrowing to prevent collapse, creating a cycle that feeds on itself. And this is where global debt truly got out of control, not through one catastrophic decision, but through thousands of small, rational choices made under pressure, each justified by the belief that tomorrow would be better, that growth would return, that normalization was just around the corner. And when it didn't, the response was always the same: more liquidity, lower rates, larger deficits, because reversing course would have meant immediate pain, and pain is politically and psychologically intolerable, especially when it can be postponed. And central banks became the quiet enablers of the system, not out of malice, but out of mandate. Tasked with stability, employment, and growth, they learned that tightening too much caused recessions, while easing too much inflated asset prices. And between those two outcomes, inflation in asset values was easier to tolerate because it felt like wealth rather than risk. And so interest rates trended downward over decades, making borrowing cheaper, refinancing easier, and leverage more attractive. And as rates fell, debt levels rose, not just because borrowing was cheaper, but because low rates signaled safety, encouraging risk-taking across the system. And this phenomenon was global, not confined to any single country, because capital flows seek yield, and when safe returns disappear, risk spreads, linking economies together through shared vulnerabilities. And by the time the global financial crisis revealed the fragility beneath the surface, the system was already too interconnected to unwind cleanly. And the response to that crisis set the template for everything that followed: massive intervention to prevent collapse, justified by the real damage a failure would cause, and successful enough to restore stability, but incomplete enough to preserve the underlying incentives that caused a problem. Because while banks were stabilized, debts were not meaningfully reduced. They were shifted, restructured, and in many cases absorbed by the public sector, transforming private excess into public obligation. And this transfer was subtle but critical because it changed who carried the burden and who had the power to manage it. And from that point onward, global debt was no longer just a financial issue. It was a political reality, because governments could not easily reduce deficits without slowing growth, cutting services, or raising taxes, all of which carried immediate consequences, while continuing to borrow felt safer, especially in a world where central banks appeared willing to backstop markets indefinitely. And this perception altered risk calculations everywhere, because when losses are socialized and gains remain private, leverage becomes rational, not reckless. And this moral hazard is not a moral failing, it is a structural one, embedded in systems where survival depends on continued expansion, and expansion increasingly depends on borrowing. And the deeper the system moved into this territory, the harder it became to escape, because high debt levels limit policy options. Raising rates threaten defaults, cutting spending threatens recession, and doing nothing allows imbalances to grow. And so the path of least resistance has always been to add more debt, smoothing over each new shock with borrowed time, whether the shock came from financial markets, geopolitical tensions, or global pandemics. And each time the scale of intervention increased because the system itself had grown larger and more leveraged, requiring more support to remain stable. And at the heart of this dynamic lies a simple psychological truth. Debt creates the illusion of control. It allows societies to believe they can have prosperity without sacrifice, growth without cost, and stability without adjustment. But illusions are fragile and they depend on confidence, and confidence depends on trust, and trust depends on the belief that obligations can ultimately be honored, not necessarily repaid in full, but managed without chaos. And this belief has held so far because defaults have been delayed, currencies have been stabilized, and institutions have adapted. But adaptation has limits, especially when demographics turn unfavorable, productivity gains slow, and environmental and geopolitical constraints tighten. Because debt is fundamentally a claim on future output, and when future output becomes uncertain, the value of those claims becomes questionable. And this is where the question of what comes next becomes unavoidable, not in the sense of predicting a single outcome, but in understanding the range of pressures the system now faces. Because there are only a few ways heavily indebted systems adjust: through growth, inflation, restructuring, or repression, and often through some combination of all four. Growth is the least painful, but also the hardest to engineer when debt is already high, because debt itself drags on growth by diverting resources toward servicing obligations rather than productive investment. Inflation can reduce the real value of debt, but it also erodes trust, distorts prices, and disproportionately affects those least able to protect themselves. Restructuring, whether explicit or implicit, involves losses, renegotiations, and political conflict. And repression, the subtle control of capital, rates, and financial flows, can stabilize systems temporarily at the cost of efficiency and freedom. And historically, societies rarely choose just one path. They drift into a mix, adjusting gradually, unevenly, and often unconsciously. And the most unsettling aspect of this process is not that it happens, but that it happens quietly, without a single dramatic moment. Because global debt does not collapse all at once, it reshapes behavior slowly, encouraging caution, reducing risk-taking where it matters most, and amplifying it where it is most dangerous. And individuals feel it as stagnation, governments feel it as constraint, and institutions feel it as fragility. And throughout this process, the same question echoes beneath the surface, not whether the debt can ever be repaid, but whether the system can continue to function without forcing a reckoning. And history offers no simple answers, because each era invents new tools, new narratives, and new justifications. But it also repeats familiar patterns, where solutions that postpone pain today create larger challenges tomorrow. And the ultimate realization is not that debt is evil or that borrowing is inherently destructive, but that systems built on perpetual expansion must eventually confront limits, whether those limits come from resources, trust, or human tolerance for imbalance. And what makes the current moment unique is not the size of the numbers, but the normalization of the idea that they no longer matter, that complexity itself has become a shield against accountability, and that as long as the machinery keeps running, the underlying strain can be ignored. But strain accumulates whether it is acknowledged or not, and when adjustment finally occurs, it rarely arrives with clarity or fairness. It arrives through confusion, negotiation, and compromise, reshaping institutions in ways that feel incremental but are deeply transformative. And perhaps the most disturbing realization is that no single decision maker controls this process anymore. It is the emergent result of countless choices made under pressure, guided by incentives that favor continuity over correction. And in that sense, the story of global debt is not about collapse or salvation, but about how complex systems adapt when they are stretched beyond their original design, and whether those adaptations can preserve stability without sacrificing the very foundations they were meant to support, a question that remains open, unresolved, and quietly shaping the future long before it announces itself.